Just a very brief video this week because you got your papers due. Uh, Want to stress if you have any questions about the paper, please let me know. Okay, because it's a little different, and you might go, well, don't quite understand this, but as I say, let me know on this. Now, human rights, civil liberties seems a little straightforward when we first talk about it, but there are some issues that I want to address and sort of push on. First of all, civil rights versus civil liberties. And the authors make a very accurate uh, distinction between the two. In reality, though, those sort of merge into each other, okay? Um, in terms of group rights, individual rights, etc. And in the common parlance, in day to day speaking, it's rare that a distinction is made. I mean, if somebody is busted by a cop, they're rarely going to say, hey, you're violating my civil liberties. They're going to say, you're violating my civil rights. Okay. So expect the two to sort of merge into each other, but very, they're very real. Now, civil rights, civil liberties, and you're going to hear me conflate the two, and I'll normally say civil rights because that's just more common. Okay. But civil rights, civil liberties versus human rights. And there is a distinction. I think it's important to recognize this. Civil rights, civil liberties, in the case of an emergency, can be temporarily curtailed. Okay. For instance, the right to association. In some cases, the right to free speech. Uh, these can be curtailed if there is an emergency. Okay, this is customarily normal in law in dealing with these. Let me use the example of COVID, and everybody in here has had to deal with it. Uh, when we were especially in the early stages of COVID, where things were just really uncertain, there were a number of civil liberties that were curtailed. The right to association, the right to free movement, uh, the right to having an education in a classroom, et cetera, et cetera. And these were curtailed. Now, some of you might remember that not everybody was happy about this, okay? But everybody, I mean, overall, people sort of went, okay, yeah, we don't like it, but, we'll live with it. And there were a lot of violations, some of which became very well known, by politicians or celebrities or the like. But they, there was an understanding that these could be curtailed for the good of the society, um, and that's the key issue. They can be curtailed, but if you following it by the book legally, they can be curtailed. Civil rights, civil liberties can be curtailed only to the extent necessary, and not 1 inch more, and for a limited time. And as soon as the crisis, the emergency of whatever sort, whether security, health, ed, natural disaster, etc., as soon as that is reasonably resolved, then the civil liberties, the civil rights come right back. So that's the key issue. Human rights can never, in theory, can never be curtailed or limited. Okay. So big distinction there. And I think that's one that I think the distinction is very, very important. Uh, so human rights are not as clean, however, as a lot of philosophers, some legal people would hold. Um, and there are a number of reasons for this. In large measure, because not every country has really bought into all the human rights. Um, and there's an argument. You'll see this, and here I'm going to use a term that I hate, but is probably as unfortunately, as good as it's going to get. This is the distinction between developed and underdeveloped countries. And you're going to, if you read anything in political science on comparative politics or the like, you'll see this, I think, later on in your readings. This is kind of the common term, developed countries uh, and either underdeveloped or undeveloped countries, okay, are developing countries. I don't like the term because it's almost has a judgmental aspect to it, but people do. With developed countries, usually people talking about like Western Europe, U.S., Canada, etc. And there are some distinctions here that political scientists will make as far as gross national product, average income, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still kind of a messy term, and as I say, it leads to some judgmental things. But anyway, but in developed countries, there's a pretty standard consensus on what are human rights. And in the little write up I gave you on this, uh, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is sort of the touchstone. It started the basis for this. And most of those I think you can go through and look at and go, okay, makes sense. These, right to essentially life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, really. Uh, the aspects of that. And this is the standard thing. If there are big international pushes, if there are international legal cases, they'll cite the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it's a useful document, certainly. And I think it, obviously should be followed. But then you get into some nuances here. As say, the first one is with some countries, and I'll uh, use some countries in the Middle East, for example, where they say, okay, we're all for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. On the other hand, some of our culture, in terms particularly of women, uh, doesn't support this. It's against our cultural values. So you get into this sort of issue. Uh, the second issue, and probably as much as a bigger one throughout the world in many ways, is okay. Yeah, we support the UN Declaration, and pretty much any UN member will say, check the block and say, oh yeah, we support this. But how far do we support this? For instance, in Western Europe, there's generally a consensus that healthcare is a human right. Okay, and it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Citizens have the uh, right to adequate health care, and the Europeans have gone, yep, and we're all into this. Most European countries, and the U.S. will say, yeah, we're absolutely a human right. Then you get to the issue of who pays for it. So yeah, it could be like in the U.S. It's a human right to have health care. On the other hand, we're not sure we're going to pay for it if we're the government. Okay. Now, this has gone considerably more toward the European style with things like the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, and certainly, things like Medicaid will push this. But, you know, it becomes a real issue. This sort of goes back to what we started with at the beginning of the course with, uh, you know, politics is frequently how one allocates resources, how one uses the money one has available, for either the good or in some cases the ill of the people. So yeah, it can be a human right, but not necessarily one that the government is going to foot the bill for. So this becomes important. Now, I don't want to sound cynical about human rights because they're absolutely critical, but you understand that it's not always as clean or as neat as we would like, and that's the big takeaway I think I would like to leave you with this week. Again, with the paper, it's a little confusing probably for some of you. Shoot me an email if you're having issues, and we'll work through it. Okay, thank you.